Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Islamic Golden Age Philosophies and Humanities by Kings and Generals. Start off with a disclaimer, I'm a little sick right now, so if my voice sounds off, or if I have to cough or clear my throat during this video, I apologize. I will try to mute my microphone if that occurs. Anyway, back to this topic. As promised, I'm doing more videos on Islamic history. So far, we've done a lot of military history about the early caliphate, but now we're getting into more social, intellectual, and cultural history. I don't really know too much about the Islamic Golden Age. Of course, it was a flourishing era of learning, intellectualism, philosophy, and science for the Islamic world. I know that much, and I'm excited to learn about it. This is sort of part one of a two-part series. This one's about philosophy and humanities, and soon we will be reacting to Kings and Generals' Islamic Golden Age scientific method. So I'm excited to get into all of that. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon link down below, or become a channel member by hitting that join button right next to the subscribe button for exclusive reaction content. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Today, the religion of Islam boasts almost 2 billion followers. Still,
Wow.
the faith itself comes from humble origins.
Yeah, true. I think Christianity is still the largest religion globally. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I know that Islam is expanding very quickly. Maybe it'll be the largest religion one day. I'm not so familiar with the demographics. Maybe some of you can tell me if that's right or not.
Islam began as a religious movement turned small nation, then empire in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Then a sprawling, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and even multi-religious country at the crossroads of Eurasian trade and cultural exchange.
This is true. I mean, we saw the emergence of the caliphate in our early Muslim expansion series, and initially a lot of that expansion seemed to be military, right? But along with that military expansion came the spread of Islam. You know, there were a lot of converts. But of course, the caliphate was an incredibly diverse empire. There were different ethnic and religious groups. I mean, if we look at it, there were Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, for religious groups. And of course, there were a ton of different ethnic groups, some of them with their own religions, many of them who converted to Islam. And that's really because of the caliphate's place sort of at the center of everything. I mean, it's in the Middle East, the Mid-East. It's at the intersection between Asia, Africa, and Europe. So you've got a lot of different civilizations, cultures, continents, all touching in one place. And so, of course, this empire is very diverse.
It's no surprise then that the ideas, cultures, and people moving through the Islamic Empire, combined with a friendly theology and government, led to what's called the Islamic Golden Age.
Right, and the caliphate plus Islam was sort of a way to unite this region. And this is when we see a lot of eras of peace, prosperity, learning, as when certain areas are united by one thing or another. They can be united by a single state, an ideology, or in this case, a religion. So this area was united by one, the state of the caliphate, and two, sort of the common bonds of Islam. Despite the diversity of the caliphate, this sort of brought everybody together, put them on the same page, and allowed them to collaborate with learning, philosophy, science, etc.
This series will discuss the contributions made to humankind in this period, a time of massive developments in science, philosophy, and medicine.
Yeah.
Today we're going to look at the humanities and social sciences, as well as explain how this golden age came to be. By this point, you probably have watched everything on your streaming services.
Alright, and here we go with Kings and Generals sponsor. So you guys go and click the link that you see in my description. That'll lead you to their video. You can give them a like, check out their sponsor. The link to their sponsor is on the screen right now. Basically show them support for making these fantastic videos.
One major factor in how the Islamic Empire enjoyed such a blossoming of thought comes from Islam itself. Somewhat unusually, many parts of the Islamic holy texts, the Quran and the Hadiths, place value on education and scientific discovery, regardless of the information's origin. Muslim scholars did not, by and large, take issue with learning from the works of non-Muslims to.
Okay, so this is interesting because let's look at the Roman Empire, which would then go on to be the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Now, there was certainly education and learning separate from Christianity, but when Christianity became the religion of the empire, it was very much emphasized over all kinds of other learning. Now, people did learn about the old pagan philosophers and rulers, but education was far more focused on religion, right? And so there was a de-emphasis on secular teaching, and I don't know if that was necessarily great for sort of the secular scientific education as a whole. It seems like this is a different situation, though, of course, Islam was a uniting factor. There was also room for education sort of separate from that, or at least, not blatantly religious. There was secular, scientific education aside from that, and it seems like they were okay with learning about figures, ideas, and philosophies that did not come from Islam. So this is a little bit different than the Christian Byzantine Empire, and a lot of Christian Europe during this period.
To advance their body of knowledge.
Of course, if we, just another quick aside, if we look at sort of the flourishing of science and philosophy in Europe, we think about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and that was an era in which a lot of European thinkers and philosophers started to move away from religion, move away from Christianity. So we can sort of see, that relationship in Europe between, religion and sort of independent thought, and how that relationship is a little bit different in the Muslim world.
A Muslim scholar by the name of Burhan al-Din proclaimed that education should be prescribed for everyone, a novel idea for the Middle Ages. Muslims would enjoy a high literacy rate due to their emphasis on learning and education as part of a well-lived life.
Yeah, that is incredibly unique. If we look at Europe during this same time period, since the days of the Roman Empire, of course, Europe has descended into the Dark Ages or the Medieval Ages, whatever you want to call it. Most people are peasants, if not serfs. The vast majority of people can't read. Really the only educated class are those associated with the church. These are, monks, religious scholars, those types of people. These are the only people really reading and writing. There are some exceptions, but it's mostly concentrated among that group of individuals. And so the vast majority of people do not know how to read or write. And so, of course, they can't be educated on the history of the past, philosophies, etc., etc. Any education that really is done for the vast majority of people is done through the church.
Schools would not only give kids a good grasp of Islamic law and analysis, but bring young scholars from different classes and backgrounds together to share ideas. In a state as large and diverse as the Islamic Empire, this led to a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. Later in the Golden Age, this process of education was formalized by schools known as madrasas. They were mosques, boarding houses, and libraries in a single compound. Some of these became the first universities to give out degrees. Additionally, the Muslim Empire invested massively in the work of scientists and philosophers. The amount the government spent in translation was massive, rivaling some of the research budgets of our times.
Yeah, and, an interesting little fact, which I suspect we might get to at some point, is that a lot of those ancient Greek and Roman works that are so renowned today, they're really seen as the basis of Western literature and philosophy. A lot of those works were forgotten by the Christian world. As I said, they had sort of moved away from any sort of pagan ideas, and a lot of that ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and texts were kept alive by the Caliphate, by the Islamic world. They translated everything into Arabic, which allowed it later to be retranslated back into Latin and used by European scholars, in much later years, as there started to be a move away from religion and an interest reemerged in those pre-Christian texts.
The symbol of this period would be the Great House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Yeah, famous.
A massive library built by the Islamic Emperor Caliph al-Mansur. The House of Wisdom is so fundamental to the Islamic Golden Age that its construction and obliteration are viewed as the start and end of it. It was one of
Very much a Library of Alexandria type deal. We're talking about that level of learning, culture, that sort of golden age of, as we're talking about in this video, philosophy, humanities, and science.
the world's biggest assortments of rare books in Persian and Arabic. The engine at the heart of this fast growing golden age was the translation movement. The Islamic Empire in most of its domain contained 10% or fewer Muslims, and very few spoke Arabic. As they expanded into the Sasanian Empire, they found a large class of Persian scholars, as well as Greek academics who left the Byzantine Empire.
Yep. Of course, Persia is a very impressive and long-standing culture of its own, and so there were a lot of Persian scholars with their own ideas, their own culture, their own traditions. Same for the Greeks. I think the Byzantines probably kept scholarly work going for the longest among the Christian powers, but even they sort of moved away from it over time. But as we can see, within the Islamic world, we have a diversity amongst the educated classes. A lot of different cultures and ideas all coming together.
The Caliphate connected them into a vast network of trade and information, but also added Arabic into the linguistic stew. Much of the information coming into the empire was in Persian, Greek, or Arabic, but could also be in Latin, Chinese, or any number of written languages from around Eurasia at the time. Scientific advancement aside, if the Caliphate wanted to function as an empire, it needed an army of translators to keep the flow of information running. When it made Baghdad its new imperial capital, the elites were inspired by Persian and Hellenistic ideas. It drove a desire to learn more from the classical Greeks.
And, we can sort of see from where the Islamic world is drawing its ideas. Of course, it has a lot of cultural production of its own, religious ideas, cultural ideas, but they're also taking a lot of ideas from Greek and Persian scholars, which makes sense because, prior to the emergence of Islam, the Greeks, aka, the Byzantines, and the Persians in the form of the Sassanid Empire were the two major empires of this region. And though the Byzantines and the Sassanids were kind of on decline already, they were cultural and intellectual powerhouses. So in some ways, the Caliphate has sort of usurped that position, and they're taking a lot of influence from those empires, particularly the Persians, of course, because, an independent Persian empire doesn't exist at this point, while the Byzantine Empire, though in decline, is still around for a long time after this point.
Furthermore, in the aftermath of the Battle of Talas in 751, the empire captured several Chinese prisoners of war. What might seem like a banal event turned out to be one of the most important breakthroughs, as it allowed for the translation movement and possibly the whole Golden Age. These prisoners knew how to make paper, which could make books easier than vellum or parchment.
Yeah, that is an extremely important invention. And by the way, if we look at a lot of the important inventions throughout time, a lot of them are coming from China. And I think China sort of had its own separate sphere from everybody else. I mean, it's interesting when we look at European and Middle Eastern, Christian and Muslim history. They are sort of intertwined, and it's kind of hard to study one without the other, though people often tell European history while ignoring Islamic history. But Chinese history is really something on its own. I mean, of course, there's that geographical separation, but they were such a major power for such a long time that they were sort of self-sustaining, right? But in instances like this, you can still see Chinese influence on the rest of the world.
First significant translation projects included taking Islamic holy texts like the Quran and translating them into various languages to spread Islam around the empire and the world.
Smart.
Furthermore, the classical works of the ancient Greeks and Persian texts were translated into Arabic, which would become a new lingua franca around the empire. Proficiency in...
And that's what I was talking about earlier, those ancient Greek plus ancient Roman works were translated into Arabic. And they would be held in Muslim worlds as, like I said, the Christian world wasn't really that interested in them at the moment. And, give them another couple hundred years, and then the Christian world will come back and be like, hey, we kind of want to see some of those old Greek texts that we all forgotten about. And guess what? The Muslims have them. They have them all translated in Arabic, and there you go.
In Arabic allowed for a language between cultures. One particularly gifted linguist translated well over 100 works by famous authors like Galen and Hippocrates. In cases like the work of Aristotle, the Arabic translations are how the work even survived to modern day.
Imagine that. Aristotle is such an important and fundamental philosopher to the Western world, to the Western tradition of philosophy. And his work was only kept alive by the Muslim world. I mean, that's how important this is just to the West. Of course, there was also a broader global importance to the Islamic Golden Age. And also, I talked about at the beginning of this how, Islam sort of brought this whole region together and allowed them to cooperate and collaborate. Same thing with Arabic. On a linguistic level, it being the lingua franca, it made it so that everybody could communicate and be on the same page. It really shows you sort of the power of this large empire, or this shared culture, or at least a shared way of communicating with everybody over such a large area.
Places like the House of Wisdom had extensive translation departments, with subject experts ready to work on pieces.
And of course, this is what something like, say, the Roman Empire did. The Roman Empire spanned, similarly to the Caliphate, a lot of different cultures, religions, people groups, but they connected everybody with the empire and with Latin. Everybody was speaking Latin. They took a lot of influences from a lot of different groups, a lot of influences from the Greeks, and so they did a similar thing where they're integrating all these cultural influences, but allowing everybody to communicate with each other and connect with each other through a common political identity, a common religious identity, and a common language. Not to mention just creating the infrastructure through which everybody can communicate. I mean, at this time period, you can really only achieve that if you have a big empire with a lot of resources.
These experts came from all over the empire, and many were Zoroastrians and Christians working with Muslims. Once a work was translated, they made several copies for distribution, using scribes with especially good handwriting. This movement is the work that kept the Western canon preserved.
Yeah.
With that established, now we can look into the social sciences and the humanities, which in the Middle Ages is just philosophy.
Yeah.
The social sciences were a long way off from being formalized. However,
Yeah, I mean, the way we view sort of the social sciences and humanities today is very different how they would have viewed them back then. I mean, if we talk about a European context, up until a pretty modern era, even science was included in philosophy. It was called natural philosophy. So philosophy was really this general term that included social sciences, humanities, and even just the hard sciences to a certain extent.
a man by the name of Ibn Khaldun, who lived during the Islamic Golden Age, is often considered the founder of many social sciences like demography, economics, historiography, and sociology.
Wow.
Ibn Khaldun was an upper-class Tunisian scholar. Due to the status of his family, he received a top-tier classical Islamic education. This education would include Arabic, Quran and Hadith studies, and law and jurisprudence study. He also successfully underwent the tasks to become a Hafiz, which is a torturous process very few Muslims do, to memorize the entire Quran.
Wow.
On top of this education, he learned maths, philosophy, and classical logic. But Ibn Khaldun didn't get into all of his social science work until after he finished a successful career as a politician in particularly unstable times in Tunisia. In the last years of his life, he penned an autobiography as well as a world history book called the Kitab al-Ibar, or the Book of Lessons. To this day, the book's chapters on the history of North African Berber people are still used as a source. In the book, he speaks of two different walks of life, both common in North Africa of his day, that of nomadic and sedentary peoples. He wrote of the effect.
Well, I mean, of course, you've got North Africa, and separating that from the rest of Africa is the Sahara, you know? So there's a lot of room for nomadic peoples in that area.
Acts of the conquest of a city on its inhabitants. Both are based on a central concept called asabia, or social cohesion. It might seem rudimentary, but this is considered some of the first works of sociological research. As he broke down the concept, he spoke of social factors leading to economic, political, and even psychological differences in cultures.
Wow.
This type of work would not see serious scholarly development until the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, he is incredibly ahead of his time. Some of the things he's talking about, social cohesion, we're speaking, economics, social sciences, psychology in a certain way. A lot of this is not going to even begin developing, at least in Europe, which I'm familiar with, until the 1800s, with the scientific revolution in the 17th century leading to the Enlightenment and sort of the development of modern science in primarily the 19th century. That's when we're going to see a lot of this stuff picked up again.
When discussing economics, it appears Ibn Khaldun is responsible for developing the labor theory of value, a central concept of economics even today.
Yeah, that is an incredibly important economic concept. We'll start hearing that again with the likes of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, some of the most important economists in history, right? These are extremely influential people, and that's about 1,000 years after this guy, so that's remarkable.
Ideas like economic growth, taxation, and GDP are centuries ahead of their time, if not a millennium.
Yeah, exactly.
Lastly, he made a strict bifurcation of what he called the non-religious sciences and the religious sciences. It was an attempt to settle a significant debate between those who wanted to focus on science and philosophy, and scholars who promoted a mystic understanding of Islamic theology.
See, and this is a separation, which I sort of talked about, that won't be realized in the Christian world up until that scientific revolution. Christianity was really the premier way of seeing things, and it was only when scientists sort of managed to break away and do a more secular version of philosophy and science that we get the development of modern science. But, of course, as we're saying, that's not going to happen until almost 1,000 years from this guy, so it's really remarkable how far ahead the Islamic world was.
Where the humanities shined, however, was in philosophy. Islamic philosophy in this age subscribed to one of two major currents. The first was Kalam, which focused more on questions to do with theology. This featured discussions about free will and rationality. One sect which took a rigorous adherence to rationality as the proper way to understand questions of theology were the Mutazilites. They in turn debated with any other schools, such as Maturidiyya, which did not see the hadiths as reliable texts at odds with reason, and largely believed in free will. Another major theological school was the Ash'ari.
Now, I will say, this is probably the only aspect of the social sciences that we will see something comparable in the Christian world, because, following the collapse of Rome, a lot of learning collapsed in Europe. A lot of secular learning, science, philosophy. The one branch that did remain was sort of religious intellectualism. In Europe, there was a lot of religious debates over philosophy and religion, debates over the Bible. That was sort of the one branch of learning that was sort of allowed to flourish under the church. And that's what I was saying earlier. If we look at Europe and sort of the medieval ages, primarily the educated class was made up of monks, religious scholars, priests, those types of people.
Whose concepts of free will were limited to choosing possibilities outlined for you by an all-knowing God. Much of the logic and discussions these currents had with each other spoke of heavy influence from Greek philosophers.
And that reminds me, sometimes we think of history as sort of this linear progression, forward and upwards, but that's really not how it works. If we look at, the social sciences, the sciences, the development of sort of learning over time, it's very clearly an up or down, We have sort of the ancient Greek culture, and ancient Roman. We can sort of add them together, sort of classical Western culture and learning. That was an era of philosophy, science, even if they didn't call it science. And then we have sort of the collapse of Rome, that goes down. We have the Islamic Golden Age, then, that sort of goes down at some point. And then we have the sort of modern scientific revolution, Enlightenment. And of course, there's these different movements in different places throughout the world at different times. So there's really not any sort of linear progression forwards and upwards. That's not how it works. In a lot of different places, there's a lot of different peaks and valleys.
One medieval theologian, Ibn Taymiyyah, even described many of these discussions as Greek solutions to Greek problems, which should never have concerned Muslims in the first place. Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism speaks to another significant theological divergence in Islamic philosophy. All of these schools used reasoned approaches to Islam, and as such, rejected literalist interpretations. This did not go unopposed by some in the clergy, who worried that this kind of thinking challenged their status in society. However, the remnants of Kalam scholars still have a significant presence in the Islam of today. Kalam is now merely the word for theology, and Islamic theology is still very academic. The second major school of philosophy is what we might more easily recognize as philosophy today. Even at the time, they borrowed the word philosophy from Greek and called this school falsafa.
And, once again, there we can see the influence of the Greeks and, their philosophical ideas, many of which were preserved by the Islamic world.
These were the scholars who discussed and built upon the works of Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Plato, publishing massive commentaries and philosophical texts. Some of these scholars were responsible for introducing their ideas, as well as those of the Greeks and Hindus, into Western Christian thought. This transfer of knowledge is one of the main reasons Aristotle went on to play such a significant role in Christian theology.
Yeah.
One philosopher,
I think Aristotle was one of the few pagan philosophers who continued to hold influence in the Christian world of the Middle Ages.
Ibn Sina, broke ground in the realm of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the area of philosophy which attempts to understand the fundamentals of reality, the study of objects, properties, and existence itself. One major schism when it comes to the prominent Greek philosophers of Aristotle and Plato was a debate about forms.
Yep.
The form, or essence of something, is what makes an object fundamentally that sort of thing, its shape, highlights, and so forth. A triangle is a triangle because it has 3 sides, as a basic example. Plato believed that all things, even abstract things, existed in a world of forms, where the perfect idea of a thing exists. What we see are mere shadows of that thing. Aristotle rejected this idea, opting to believe that an object's form existed in this world, and that all objects were made of both object and form. Ibn Sina wanted to marry these two ideas in an exploration of the soul, and also to prove the soul exists. He did so with a thought experiment. It's a famous one from philosophical history, the floating man. In this, he wants to imagine a man falling freely in the air. With no ability to see other things in reference to oneself, a person could still experience their presence and consciousness. Ibn Sina believed this to be evidence that there is a soul, which is immaterial within, showing both external properties, but also of another plane, attempting to marry the two concepts.
Oh man, this is reminding me of, reading philosophy in college. Some interesting stuff, but sometimes it does sort of get away from me.
This idea is very similar to the famous starting point for Descartes, who centuries later would become famous for his line, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
How about that? Yeah, no, that does make sense. And, of course, Descartes was very much a revolutionary figure. Now, a lot of his ideas were proven completely wrong, and there's, a bit of a rivalry between sort of the continental Descartes and, say, like a Francis Bacon in Britain, who is a little more focused on what we might call science, the scientific method. But Descartes was still an extremely influential figure who came much after the Islamic Golden Age.
In the realm of epistemology, the philosophical work of understanding knowledge, learning, and understanding, Philosophers worked to understand the human mind. For the sake of this video, let's discuss one back and forth in the realm of the story of self-education, also known as autodidactism.
Okay.
Arab philosopher Ibn al-Nafis, to explore the idea of how one might learn without any other humans, wrote a philosophical novel called Theologus Autodidactus. This novel was a first on many fronts, founding many literary mainstays. It was one of the first Arabic language novels ever made. It had a coming-of-age story long before that was to become a popular theme. It took place on a desert island, of which it may have been one of the first examples.
Wow, oftentimes when we talk about coming-of-age stories and sort of the invention and popularization of the novel in the Western world, once again, we talk about the 1800s rather than, in the medieval ages, which is when the Islamic Golden Age is taking place.
It even had elements of the apocalypse and explaining the afterlife with astronomy, biology, and theology, which have led some historians to consider it a very early inkling of what would become science fiction. The novel itself is about a boy who spontaneously came to life on a desert island and meets castaways who wind up on his home. Ibn al-Nafis wrote the main character, Kamil, to be a complete human blank slate in which to observe the world. It's about how an uninitiated person comes to find the necessity of God, Islam, and rationality. The character then explores the sciences and philosophy. It's not a page-turner, but it acted as an essay to explore many different ideas about the world Ibn al-Nafis knew about as a polymath.
See, and a lot of these ideas are not going to be explored again in the Western world until the Enlightenment. There was this common idea in the Christian world that one could not be born as a blank slate because one was born with some idea of Christianity and God as the one and only God. Now, these ideas were challenged by John Locke in the 1700s. He presented the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate, right? The idea that, you're born as a blank slate and you learn through your own experience. And that was a pretty damn revolutionary idea for the time. It was extremely influential. And we're seeing sort of a similar idea being explored hundreds and hundreds of years before. It's really remarkable.
It was a response to a desert island book called Hey Ibn Yaqdan, which itself was a response to the incoherence of the philosophers.
I love that. Just titling your book this does not make sense.
They were interested in which aspects of rational thought and belief came innately from the human mind, and which had been learned. Theologus Autodidactus and Hey Ibn Yaqdan both featured feral children who explored their various ideas on it. These philosophers would have massive impacts on philosophers throughout the centuries. Ibn Sina, mentioned earlier, is often called in the West Avicenna and is one of the greats. Averroes or Ibn Rushd, as well as Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali and Al-Kindi are all some of the most revered philosophers in the history of ideas. Their work influenced how Western Christians came to conceive of God.
The Muslim world had so much influence on the Western world, Western philosophy, Western history. I wish we sort of got more of that in our history educations. Just in general. Not like in school we're learning a whole lot about philosophy or intellectual history, but I do wish we would learn more about that influence, because the Islamic world was really so important globally, and in particular, it's important to the Western world. There's a lot of influence there. The Islamic community was influenced by the ideas of, say, the Greeks, and then the Islamic world went on to influence the Western world tremendously. It's sort of a really important point of contact, I think.
The ways they argued his existence and conceptions of the soul. The translation projects brought the Greco-Roman philosophical works to the West, where they otherwise might not have been preserved. It's tough to conceive of Western civilization without the contributions of the Muslim philosophers of the Islamic Golden Age. And we're just scratching the surface with philosophy. Over the next videos in this series, we'll look at other places where the Islamic Golden Age changed the world. Next time we'll look at the sciences, as well as mathematics, then medicine and healthcare, then inventions and engineers of the Islamic Golden Age, and the multitude of technological innovations. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button.
Alright, sounds like we've got a lot to go. I'm excited. Like I said, we're getting to the scientific method. I'll have to see if there's other videos that kings and generals did on the Islamic Golden Age. That'd be fascinating. But yeah, I mean, the Islamic Golden Age really had such a monumental influence on the world and the West. Preserving these Greco-Roman philosophies and ideas, it's really remarkable that, without these Muslim scholars, the West very well might have forgotten a lot of its own tradition and its own history. So it just really shows you how important this is, and I'm glad we're doing a video on it. I've been interested in this loosely for a while, but like I said, I don't really know much about the topic, so I'm excited that we're getting some more information. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd very much appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon or channel memberships. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.